As we prepare to begin this evening's talk, we would ask if you would kindly mute and stop your video. If you wish to see the presenter full screen, just click on the speaker icon in your view menu in the upper right or left corner of your screen, depending on what you're using for an electronic device. Welcome to the fourth of our 7 Lenten speaker series talks. I am Father Michael Carrier, the pastor of the Church of the Holy Child. This series is being sponsored by the Brandywine 100 Deanery. We hope to have many more joint projects with our 6 parishes over the next 3 years. The Brandywine 100 Deanery is made up of the Church of the Holy Child, Holy Rosary, Immaculate Heart of Mary, St. Helena's, St. Joseph's on the Brandywine, and St. Mary Magdalene parishes. Your deanery team leadership, made up of lay people and led by me, has been working for the past year on a strategic plan for our deanery. More information on that plan will be coming forth after Easter. For our series, each of our speakers in the series has agreed to speak for 40 to 45 minutes, then to allow 15 to 20 minutes for questions. All questions will be held until the end of the meeting. If you have a question, we ask that you please send it to brandywinedeanery@gmail.com, and we will ask as many of the questions during the question period as possible. Again, that is brandywinedeanery@gmail.com. I'm excited this evening to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. RJ Snell. RJ is the Editor-in-Chief of Public Discourse, the Director of Academic Programs at the Witherspoon Institute, and a director of the Aquinas Institute for Catholic Life at Princeton University. He is currently a visiting instructor in the Department of Politics at Princeton. Previously, he was a tenured full professor of philosophy at Eastern University and Templeton Honors College. RJ is the author of Lost in the Chaos: Immanence, Despair, Hope. He and his family reside in the Princeton area. We're very grateful this evening for RJ to be speaking to us. As a reminder, if you have any questions during his talk, please email them to us at brandywinedeanery@gmail.com. RJ, welcome.
Thank you so much, Father Michael, and my thanks to Ellen for the invitation and to the Brandywine Deanery, not only for putting together what looks to be a very fine speaker series, but for the invitation to join you. And my thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. It's a good sign when people want to learn more and have conversation, and I'm grateful to everyone. I know that Zoom gives us the great benefit that we can get together despite and across distances, but it can also make things a little awkward. It's hard to read the room. It's hard to know if your jokes are falling flat. It's hard to know if people are understanding you. So thanks for your patience with that as well. The topic for the evening is about the challenges and opportunities of passing on the faith. We live in both difficult times and times which call us to intelligence and prayer and love, and we'll think through some of that. Some of this is directly relevant for parents. I think a lot of it can be applied, or I hope, for grandparents, godparents, aunts and uncles, parents of parents, for pastors, kind of principles which can apply in many ways. And I look forward to your questions. Leon Kass, one of the great scholars from the University of Chicago, opens his book, Leading a Worthy Life, by noting the sad reality that our society has produced, as he puts it, a world prosperous beyond all previous imaginings, even as with every passing decade, it's become ever more spiritually impoverished. He says that is the great war on poverty which faces us, the war on spiritual poverty, which he thinks has left many with fat wallets but really thin souls, suffering from a spiritual poverty so profound that people don't know God, and as a result don't know what is up, what is down, what's left and what's right, what's near and what's far. And the child who grows up without God is somewhat adrift, like one floating in space, sort of waving their arms in frantic effort but unable to go anywhere. And that's so even if the child is rewarded with accolades and prizes and honors and accomplishments, admission to the best colleges, the best law schools, and so on. A lot of glitter, but perhaps not much orientation to the divine. Children who know how to do algebra but don't know how to pray is a kind of spiritual poverty. Now, it's very easy, although I have little patience for it, to sort of blame the kids these days. Sort of the get off my lawn mentality if things were better back in the day. I'm not so patient with that in some ways because it seems to me that the children that we're talking about, those we're hoping will find faith, carry on the faith, recover faith perhaps, that so-called Gen Z and the young millennials, despite what we might think of them, are in many ways doing exactly what they've been told and taught to do by the adults in the room. They're doing what their parents have modeled, what their teachers have told them, what some pastors have told them, what celebrities and online influencers and politicians and football stars have taught them to do. They are indeed responsible for their own actions, but they don't exist in a vacuum, and they are often representing and following through with social values that they've been taught by others, including by adults. So let's think a little bit about what it's like to be a 17-year-old these days. First, let's consider their experience, the young person's experience of family and intimacy. Just a few years ago, the statistics told us that the percentage of adults who never married in the United States was the highest in recorded history. Tax returns by single heads of household at 40 years old were the highest ever. Many young adults don't plan on marrying. Many more don't plan on having children. The no child policy is very popular among the young. So very few have children, and so few children at that. We're now in the United States well below replacement rates. You need 2.1 children per woman to have a replacement rate. We're well below that now. Of children who are born in the United States, the national average is that 40% are born out of wedlock, almost half. 32% of young boys do not live with their biological fathers, and 63% of youth suicides come from homes without fathers. Almost 30% of Generation Z report being LGBTQ or non-binary. Imagine the reality of being 13 years old, going through puberty, but it's not 1960 or 1980 or 1990, but 2024. And your major influence as you worry through the changes of body and emotion is not stable family, but rather TikTok and other forms of social media telling you about your body and the freedom you might get from deciding that you're in the wrong one. Or consider this. In the United States, the average age that boys first access pornography is 13 years old. 15% of boys report being under 10 years old when they first experience pornography. And the kind of pornography they have access to is often quite violent. When I was young, I grew up in a small town in Western Canada. You would go to the local store, the Video Hut, and you would rent Rocky 1 or Rambo or whatever you rented when you were 13 years old. And in the back corner of the Video Hut, there was these beads, and you knew that there was pornographic movies back there. But one would have had to been at 13 incredibly bold or shameless to walk through the beads, walk to the back, get pornography, walk to the front, go to the clerk in a small town where everyone knew who you are. But of course, for young children now, it's merely a click on the phone away. It's 2 seconds away and it's anonymous. As a result, approximately 20% of college women report that in their most recent sexual experience, consensual, they've been choked. Why? Because young boys begin looking at pornography at 13. At the same time, sex rates are down both within and outside of marriage. There's lots of pornography, but not so much romance, not so much dating, and even not so much friendship. A significant percentage of young people report not having a single friend offline. All of their friends are on social media, not a single friend. A huge percentage say that they would have no friend to call if they needed help. And it turns out those numbers are far worse for men than they are for women. That's their experience of family and intimacy. Second, consider their experience of religion. It's often thought that decreases in religious observance are largely at fault or how to explain the decline of marriage and family and childbearing. But there's even better reasons to think that the roles are actually quite reversed, that it's the loss of family and the loss of stable families which is responsible for the decline of religion and religious observance. Most people experience religion and have religion given to them by family. It seems to follow that when the family declines, so too will religion. As a result, we know that the largest religious group in the United States now is the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, those who don't have any particular religion or any particular religious belief, nothing. That group is now estimated between 20 to 29% of Americans have no particular religion or religious belief. That's the largest single religious group in the United States. It's larger than evangelicals, it's larger than Catholics. And it turns out that a good percentage of the so-called nones were raised in religious homes. It's sometimes said, I don't think this is statistically true, but the point is true nonetheless, that the second largest religious group in the United States are non-practicing Catholics, former Catholics, and that makes up a huge percentage of the nones. Depending on who you read, perhaps only 17% of adult Catholics attend Mass weekly, and only 43%, less than half, of Americans say they attend religious services at least once a year. When I was in college, I'm a Generation X. When I was in college, the so-called book of my generation was published. It's called Life After God by Douglas Copeland. Copeland makes the argument that my generation was the first that was raised without God. It wasn't a normal part of our family or not a normal part of our childhood. And yet the loss of God was experienced as a loss, as a tragedy. Something had been taken away, something was missing. Now many argue that that loss of God is not experienced as a loss, not experienced as a tragedy. It's not experienced at all. It's not a reality that one knew and then set aside. It just was never there. And that there is no longer, for many young people, a sense that there is inner depths of the soul, that there's something within, a God-spaced hole to fill. Instead, we have quite externalized selves, what I like to call pixelated selves, selves which are more true on the screen, more true on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat. We think of ourselves as pixels and bytes on the screen. Third, think of their experience. First, the loss of family. Second, the loss of religion. Third, it's no surprise that the young report shocking rates of anxiety and stress. The stats on this are simply remarkable. They're really unbelievable. Most of my work is done at American colleges, so that's my experience. I can tell you about college students. There's a great book written a few years ago called Excellent Sheep by William Dershowitz. He taught at Yale at the time, and he reports his Yale students as being absolutely remarkable, wonderful children, disciplined, well, young adults, disciplined, intelligent, driven, ambitious. But as he describes it, if you looked beneath the surface, what you found were what he called or described as toxic levels of anxiety. They were terrified to fail. As a result, he says, they played it safe. They colored between the lines. They took no intellectual risks. Now, one way to think of that is the young experience the loss of job opportunities, high student loans, incredibly high housing prices, and so on. He suggests, and I agree with him, that rather it's a kind of Olympian understanding of life and of their education. They've been pressed to live the Olympic goal of stronger, faster, higher, faster. Get into the right kindergarten, get into the right pre-K, the right schools, worry about the SAT. Mark Schiffman, who used to teach at Villanova, says that the novel Hunger Games is the novel of the generation. In Hunger Games, you have young people who are put into a battle for the death for the entertainment of adults. They're thrown into an arena and they battle literally to the death for the entertainment of those watching on television. It's a kind of perverse reality television show in the novel. But here's Schiffman's point. He says the young people have been trained by the adults to engage in what they understand to be meaningless life and death competition. And as a result, when they go to college, this is Schiffman's language, they don't major in physics or philosophy or chemical engineering. They major in fear. They're afraid to fail. And so they live lives of desperate competition, racking up, he says, majors and minors and internships and credentials. Why? Because they're afraid. So when we think of the young and what they're experiencing, we see our young having been raised in a society without siblings, without stable families, families under extreme pressures financially, families in which much of the society is teaching the young that family is not healthy, not desirable, not good, not to be repeated in their own lives, not important. Our society has raised children without religion and the pathways of wisdom and its comforts, the long experience that religion provides about how to live well, without the beauty of religion and the joy of religion. And as a result, our kids are lonely, stressed, pressured, and afraid. And I haven't even yet mentioned smartphones, which makes it all the worse. And here we are, all of us, doing our best to be good parents, good grandparents, an aunt and uncle, godparent, friends of parents, a priest, shepherds families. And we all know that no matter how hard we try, whatever techniques we use, there are no guarantees that our children or grandchildren, friends, nieces will stay in the church. We can have them baptized, we can take them to first communion, first confession, we can take them to mass, and we know that the statistics are the statistics, that there is no way to guarantee that they will stay in the faith, that they may in fact leave the teachings of the faith behind. So what to do? That's why we're here tonight, to think about what to do. Well, I have a few suggestions. I'd like to start with very abstract ones. I don't mean by that they're unimportant. I think they're the foundational principles for the rest. And then a few more concrete suggestions later on. My wife, who loves to tease me, will sometimes say that my concrete suggestions tend not to be very concrete. I'm a philosopher by training, and my concrete suggestions are often quotations from Plato or Aristotle, which no one other than me thinks is concrete. But some suggestions, starting with the abstract, which is not to say unimportant. Here's the first. This will seem self-evident, and yet I think it's one of the most vital things to remind ourselves when we're thinking about handing on faith to the children. We should remember that there is a God, and that God does not will that any should perish. Our children and our grandchildren are not ours. They're not our property or our possession. They're not our projects. They're not our accessories. They are God's children. And they are born as persons. A child from conception on is a person. And persons are created as free and created in the image of God. We have duties to tend for our children, to nurture them, to educate them, to protect them, but they're not ours. Persons cannot be owned. Persons can only be respected. And no matter how much we want our children to maintain the faith and to live lives of which we approve and celebrate, it is always wrong. We ought not ever to coerce our children, to manipulate them, to cajole them. We can love them. We can create an atmosphere of joy. We can nurture them. We can educate them. But we do not save them. God saves them. It is a firm teaching of the Catholic faith that the gift of faith is a gift of the Holy Spirit. It's an infused virtue. It's not acquired. We can become courageous by doing courageous things over and over again. We face our fear once and we get over it. We face our fear a second time, and we get over it. We face our fear a third time. Eventually we'll be courageous. Faith is not like that. Faith is not something that we can acquire on our own efforts. We can cooperate with grace. We can get in the way of grace. We can set conditions such that make straight the paths of the Lord, the way that John the Baptist does for our Lord, for our own children. But it is the Holy Spirit who saves and the Holy Spirit who gives faith. We pray. We are all, in a sense, like St. Augustine's mother, Monica. Augustine, the great saint, was a terrible child. He was a terrible young man. He made every mistake that could be made. He admits it himself in his book, The Confessions. And Monica follows him around the Mediterranean, praying for him and praying for him. Well, he's a saint, one of the great ones, and so is she. Let's remember that it is the Holy Spirit who in the end will save our children, and that he is the hound of heaven, in the words of the poet. He chases our children. He persuades our children. He gives grace to our children. Or in the words of another poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, however much we concern ourselves for our well-being and worry for our children's well-being, here's the words: God keeps us with far fonder a care. He keeps us with far fonder a care kept than we would ever care for ourselves or our children. There's not a hair of our children's head which goes unnumbered by God. And that is a source of enormous hope and trust. As a result, we can approach our children entirely as persons, not as projects. And if they're persons, there are certain ways or certain approaches that we can have in their education and in their catechesis, which are entirely appropriate. And there are other ways that might be shortcuts. They might feel good. They might seem more certain. And yet they are, in a sense, not open to us, because to use those approaches would be to not treat them as persons, as free, as created in the image of God. I want to stress this a lot. The ways that we attempt to educate our children, to catechize them, cannot in any way diminish or belittle their personhood. We can give them an example of life. We can create atmospheres in the home. We can give them training and education, but we cannot coerce. So let's talk a little, that's the abstract. Let's talk about a few more pragmatics, such as they are. Here's the first, the talk, the infamous talk about sex. We have to do this. My own father gave me the talk, the only time that he gave me the talk about sexuality, the only time we've ever talked about it, I think, about 2.5 weeks after I was married. Well, thanks, Dad. That wasn't so helpful. That approach is just off the table now. If 15% of young men see pornography by the time they're 10 or younger, it's simply no longer an option for us to not have the talk with our children and grandchildren. However embarrassing it is, however awkward, we must, with all due discretion and modesty, entirely keeping with the modesty and discretion of our children who are persons, we need to have the talk. And we need to have it perhaps earlier than we would want, and perhaps talking about more than we would wish. A phrase that's often used by Canavox, which is Witherspoon, I work at the Witherspoon Institute, Witherspoon's marriage and family organization. This is a great little book, Tips for Talking to Your Kids About Sex, begins with when they're 2 and goes through to their adults. You can find this on canavox.com. A phrase that they love to use is better 5 months too early than 5 days too late when it comes to the talk. It's early and it's often. We start when they're young, talk about modesty, we talk about the dignity of their bodies. But we also, even when they're little, talk about the trajectory and purpose of bodies. We attempt to explain to them that bodies, in the words of John Paul II, are spousal. They're made to be generous. They're made to have children. Not all of us will have children. Not all of us will marry. But our bodies, nonetheless, are made for communion. They're made for family. They're made to have children. And that is lovely, dignified, and a beautiful responsibility. When the children are older, we have plain talk with them. Not hidden in catchphrases and false modesty, real modesty, not false modesty. We have plain talks with them about lust, about the dangers of pornography, about the horrors of pornography. We include plain talks about how even adults have struggles. One of the gifts for families, for parents who are using natural family planning, is that it provides a very easy and natural way to talk to daughters, and sons too, in a slightly different sense, about how the body works and what it's for. In one sense, we want our children to be the most educated children at their schools about sexuality and how it works. We don't want them to show up at school not knowing anything about sex, relying upon their friends to tell them about it, where their friends are learning about sex from pornography. We want them to know how the body works, what fertility is, what human love is, what marriage is, and that all of that is part of God's plan, the dignity of the body, and the meaning of the body. It also gives us a remarkable opportunity to befriend our children. We often want to parent our children, and that's great. But at the end, we would like to be friends with them. I would like my children at 24 to be my friends. Still their parent, but I would like them to be my friends. And so for those who use something like natural family planning, it provides an easy access point to talk to teenage children about abstinence, about chastity, about temptations, because those things exist for adults too. It turns out, and this is perhaps a great shock when one gets married, that not all of marriage is always the days of wine and roses and honeymoons. It's not just endless days of sexual bliss. It includes illness and disease and patience and forgiveness and times of abstinence as well. As part of this, parents need, grandparents, godparents, need to educate themselves. We need to study about this. We need to read tips for talking to your children about sex. We need to read from Witherspoon, Marriage and the Public Good, 10 Principles. This used to be called the Princeton Principles on Marriage. We need to read Theology of the Body. We need to read the Catechism. We need to read John Paul II. We need to take an online class about how NFP works. We need to be ready. We need to know our stuff, and we need to be ready to talk about it. We can't be hiding. The temptations and challenges that the children face is just qualitatively different than it was not that long ago because of the internet and the prevalence of pornography and really violent pornography. Better 5 months too early, slightly embarrassing them, than 5 days too late. And in order to do that, we need to know our own stuff and study as well. Now, telling is good. Talking is good. Early and often is good. Showing is better. As much as we tell our children about the joys of marriage, showing them the joys of marriage and the joys of being a parent or a godparent or a grandparent is even better. Our cultured despisers are relentlessly telling our children, a relentless cultural catechism. They get it all day long, every day, that marriage is not good, that children are an enormous burden, that chastity is weird or repressive or unhealthy. They get this all day long at school, in their entertainment, in their music, in their movies, in their television, in their social media. We don't do our children any favors if we simply talk at them. We have to talk early and often, but we don't do them any favors if we merely tell them how great marriage is and don't attend to our own marriages. Amy and I have been married coming up in 25 years this summer. And we have a phrase that we take from the Song of Solomon about the little foxes. There's a verse in the song which talks about how the little foxes come into the vineyard and eat the grapes. Well, the way we interpret that is that the little foxes coming into the vineyard to eat the grapes are our children. We love them enormously. We have 5 kids. They're beautiful. I love them. And yet they're little foxes. We need to attend to our own marriage so that it is fun and lively and delightful and merry. Children love it when they see their grandparents love each other. Children feel enormously secure when they know that dad loves mom and mom loves dad, and that in the end, dad cares for mom slightly more than he cares for the children. Or another way of putting it, he loves and cares for his children because he loves mom so much. One of the things that Amy and I do often, this is with all due modesty, is I come home from work, she comes home from work or her tasks or what have you, and we kiss in the kitchen. Nothing immodest. But one of the things that often amuses me is that throughout the years of marriage with children, as I've kissed her in the kitchen rather, how often I've looked down to see a small, tiny face looking back up at me between our legs, some little child on the kitchen floor who's crawled there, to be in the space that he knows, that she knows, is a source of security and stability. We have to love our spouses a lot and show our kids that it's a great time. We have to kiss in the kitchen. We have to have fun. We have to go on dates. We have to enjoy each other. We have to have a life. Following from that, my next bit of advice, third, but going beyond just spouses, we have to work enormously, I think, to create an atmosphere in the house where the house is a place that's bright and cheerful. Homes are for living in. Everyone who has that experience of bringing the first child home knows that your house goes perhaps from being, ready for a picture in Architectural Digest to something in which there are toys and crayons and food and Cheerios and cats and dogs and dirty dishes. Homes should not be barren and ugly, but homes are in fact meant to be lived in. We want our kids to want to be home. Home should be a place that is redolent, that smells of laughter and joy. My wife sometimes tells the story of her own grandmother making Sunday gravy. It's a ragu, and it would simmer in the oven all day, so that when the children and grandchildren came home after going to mass, after going to the beach, what have you, there was the smell in the home of Sunday gravy, which had been simmering in the oven for hours. She wanted to be there. We need this sort of sense of smell in our own house, a sense or atmosphere that this is a good place to be. We want our children to be at our homes, including when they do the things like break the vase and color on the walls. Children are children. It is not a failure to be a child. Let them be at home when they're at home. Order is good. We want an orderly home. But children will bring marks on the walls, burnt frying pans. There's going to be a teenage boy playing a guitar too loudly. It's going to be noisy, but we want it to be bright and cheerful. We want friends who roughhouse. We want boyfriends and other girlfriends of our children eating our food. Lights will be left on. Saints are virtuous, to be sure, and order is a good thing, but order is not deadly. Our homes are not monasteries. Virtue is not prim and proper behavior. Virtue is loving in the right way at the right time. We want our homes to be bursting with life and to have an atmosphere of life. Fourth bit of advice. I like to call this bright eyes and fat souls. Fat souls is a translation of a verse in Proverbs in the King James translation of the Bible. And it's the verse is, the magnanimous soul, the generous soul shall be made fat. I love this image. Earlier, I said that we have created a society in which there are fat wallets and thin souls. It would be better to have thin wallets and fat souls. We want our children to have the marrow, the good stuff, right? When you get a good cut of meat, you want you want marbling, you want fat on the side of it. It's juicy that way. We want our children to have souls that way as well. And then bright eyes. When Amy and I had just had our first child, I think Grace at the time was, 4 months old. We didn't know what we were doing at all. Still don't. We were at a restaurant and a group of children paraded in. And Amy and I looked at each other and said, those children all have unusually bright eyes. They seem interested in the world. They seem to be in a very large world and they seem to be very interested in it. Let's have our own children be that way. Bright eyes and fat-souled children. Now, how do we do that? Well, here's a few suggestions as part of this fourth bit of advice. First, as hard as it is, be the parent. It's a great title of a great book by Naomi Schaefer Riley. Be the parent, please. That means at times struggling with children to keep them from having a phone or having social media. You won't regret having your children wait 1 more year to have a phone or to have social media. I don't think anyone has said, I wish I'd gotten Facebook earlier than I did. But here's the second bit of this. Whatever we limit for our children, perhaps we don't have social media, we don't have a phone, we don't watch those movies, we don't listen to this sort of music. We won't get bright eyes and fat souls, and our children won't have fat souls and bright eyes if we simply take away. The life of holiness is not a negative life. There are things that we don't do. But to be holy is not merely to refrain from doing wrong, it's to live fully. St. Irenaeus says that the glory of God is man fully alive. We're not trying to avoid just doing wrong. We're trying to have the fullness of good things. Now, the way that works with children, I think, primarily is if we want them to think of the faith and the life of holiness as joyful, is we can't simply take away movies, take away phones, take away social media. We have to give them better things. So here's a few examples. There's certain music that we don't let our kids listen to. But of course, you can't have a home without music. And the 12-year-old is maybe not so interested in listening to Mozart. We'll get there eventually. But we have to give them something better. When they're teenagers and beset with social anxieties, our approach has been to give them something that's cooler than their friends know. So no, you can't listen to this bit of American pop culture music. But you know who Miles Davis is? Well, neither do your friends. You'll be cooler than they are. Do you know who Thelonious Monk is? No, neither do your friends. You'll be the coolest kid in school. Or no, we're not going to let you watch the Marvel Avengers action movie Part 29 because it's sort of twaddle. But on the other hand, here's a really great movie from Iran that your friends will think that you are a film connoisseur if you know. The point is this, whatever the details, we don't merely remove, we replace with the best of things. The Catholic life is a beautiful life. Ours is a culture and a history which made the great basilicas and the great universities and great works of art and great works of music and great works of poetry and literature. Let's offer those things to our kids. We may take away, but we have to replace with even better things that the children will find lovely and frankly appealing to their sense of you'll be cool is actually okay. Next bit of bright eyes and fat souls, books. Books are to the mind what food is to the body. We have to have books. You may be a reader, you might not be a reader. Your family may be scholarly, your family may not be scholarly. That's fine. We don't all have to be nerds and scholars, but there must be books in the home for children if they're going to have ideas. Well, what sorts of books? John Senior, who was a very famous professor who created something called the Integrated Program for Humanities at Kansas State University, which was eventually shut down because while they didn't say anything about the faith, they had so many religious conversions and in the end religious vocations that they assumed they must be proselytizing and shut them down. Senior makes the argument that what we need most for children, especially children who live in societies like ours where everything is mediated by the screen, is to give them access points to reality. And one way to give them access points to reality is good books that have adventure in them. I have some of my favorites: Wind in the Willows, the Narnia stories. I love Peter Rabbit. I can't wait to read my kids Peter Rabbit. Even the older ones are like, enough, Dad, we've outgrown this. Stories of adventure, adventurers, explorers, and so on. The sorts of things which awaken in children's imagination a sense that life is an adventure, and that nobility and struggle and sometimes even self-denial is not a loss, but a gain. So much of what we're trying to do is form an imagination, a kind of taste, an ideal. We can't do that with words alone. We can't do that with instruction alone. Children have to get it through a sense of feeling and taste and touch, and a lot of that is done through imagination. And the good books give a kind of imagination. Here's another bit about bright eyes rather, and fat souls. Sabbath. It's no accident that God reminds his people in the Hebrew scriptures to remember the Sabbath. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel says in his book on the Sabbath that while in the Genesis 1 story, Sabbath, the seventh day, comes last, it's actually first in God's intention. What is created last is what God is working towards. What we've become quite accustomed in a culture of what Joseph Pieper calls total work to not keep Sabbath. We work all the time, or we entertain ourselves all the time, and we entertain ourselves in order to work more. Sabbath is, in fact, an occasion for delight. When I was a kid, after church, one always went to Grandma's house. And Grandma always had a roast beef. It was a very sort of British family in that sense. I grew up in Canada. There was always a roast beef. It was always overcooked. You always had a roast beef, but your uncles and aunts and cousins always came. There were always board games because it was Sunday. There was always a long prayer from Grandpa. And then you played in the backyard, you ran around, you shot the basketball. But the sense that was that Sabbath was different than other days. Sabbath was for church and for worship, to be sure. But Sabbath also included delight. There's a scene in the Little House on the Prairie series of books, so famous, where they keep Sabbath, but it's a joyless day. If they're near a town, they go to church, but the rest of the day, they're not allowed to do anything. They can read Bible stories. That's it. No playing, no singing, no laughing, because it's the Sabbath. Well, that's not the Catholic understanding. We keep the Great Feast. We keep the Eucharist. Sabbath is a day oriented around a feast. Why is it then that so much of our Sabbath day looks like every other day? An occasion to not go to work, so an occasion to go to pick up groceries. We live lives in the modern America of profound loneliness. The social sciences say that loneliness is one of the great public health risks in American society. It's called an epidemic of loneliness. Why aren't Sabbaths? Why don't we work to have Sabbath be about Mass and worship, and then at home, a feast and friends and song and poetry, inviting a priest over to tell stories, Grandpa there to plunk out tunes on the piano, Grandma to tell stories of her childhood, someone single from our parish brought over to be part of life. If we can do that, we'll show our children that the life of faith is deeply joyous, and that our rules, the precepts of the church, the things that we are commanded to do and the things we're commanded to not do, are not life-denying, they're not weird, they're not repressive, they're not oppressive. They are the ancient wisdom given to us by God, experienced through the life of the church and its tradition, known by its saints and its theologians, and millions of plain people like me and you, that the life of faith and its rules is inherently and intrinsically about love of God, love of neighbor, and the joy that that brings. I'm quite convinced that if we did more to work on creating an atmosphere of joy rooted in religiosity as opposed to a dourness about rules, we would keep our children, and that they would think that this is the best game in town. I'm so convinced that when we look at contemporary society, we do not see, in those people who do not have faith, enormous swaths of society having a great time. I see loneliness. We see death, so-called deaths of despair. We see violence, polarization. The list goes on. I think we can do better. And if we did better, our children would think that the atmosphere of the faith is where they want to be. And if they want to be there, and if they imagine it as joyous and good and life-giving, the teaching of the faith, the sense of the catechesis, the things we believe, will not only be much easier for them to appropriate and understand, but they'll see that as not abstract and alien, but as the forms of good life. Here's my last bit about bright eyes and fat souls. I'm big on this one. Dance. Dance is an ordinary human thing. All societies have folk dances, except ours. Our society has no folk dances anymore. And why does this matter? Well, there's lots of dancing in our society, but it's the sort of isolated eroticism of the club scene. But folk dance, on the other hand, is a kind of joyous training in love and eroticism under the watchful eyes of the elders. Dance, folk dance especially, is a kind of tradition. One learns the steps from your grandfather, one learns the steps from your grandmother, but it's also community. The whole parish is packed together in the basement of the church. It's hot. And there's grandma, there's grandfather, there's your godfather, there's your nephew, there's your niece, there's your cousin, the old and the young, all brought together. If I were the pastor of a parish, I would take seriously folk dancing in the basement. Forgive me, I'm going to read you something that I wrote some years ago about dancing. How obnoxious to read your own writing, but what are you going to do? Recently, my wife and some friends threw a party culminating in traditional English line dancing. This is the sort of thing you see in Jane Austen movies, lines of men and women moving and so on. It's sort of like folk dance, like line dancing or square dancing. I'd not done that before, and I went to the party somewhat hesitant. But there we were, all jammed together in an overheated room, stomping and clapping, bowing and twirling to the fiddle and guitar. Mostly, though, we were exulting. I held my youngest daughter to her shrieking delight as her older sister and I do-si-doed and promenaded, and a triumphant son somehow convinced an older and rather pretty partner to stoop down to his level. Unlike other days, teenage boys could not escape their mother's arms, and I saw mom so jubilant and merry and relieved at this that they paraphrased Simeon, "Lord, now let your servant depart in peace." Grandfathers dancing with granddaughters, husbands dancing with wives, friends dancing with each other, a few yearning adolescents with hearts beating time to another more ancient reel. In that sweltering, overcrowded room, you could hear the music and see us leaping, joined in circles, feet rising and falling in mirth. The association of men and women holding each other by the hand or arm. Paraphrasing T.S. Eliot there. I was drunk with it, flushed of body and soul, delighted with the others, thrilled with reality. We were not, as I feared, ironical or skeptical, but approving. We approved in the old sense of the term, the Latin sense of the term, in that we recognized goodness, probus, and we loved it. We willed that it should be, that it should exist, that it should continue, that we should hand it off from one partner to the next. We handed on tradition. It's the meaning of tradition, to hand on, the rhythms of a good reality which preceded us, following the patterns long set down by others, and it was good. I think the life of religion and the life of faith should be more like that and less a sense where the children feel scolded. It's true what we believe, and the truth is good. We should give them a sense that it's good. That's all several instances of bright eyes and fat souls. My fifth general sense is authority. We need to understand our authority. By authority, I don't mean being the boss, and I don't mean having power over our children and grandchildren. By authority, I mean a deputized responsibility given to us by God. Remember my claim earlier. Children are born persons. As born persons, they are created for their own sake and are thus not our property. They're placed into our care. They're God's. God has deputized responsibility to us. Authority is an office that we have given to us by God in service to others. In the sense that the Pope is the servant of the servants of God, we care for and serve our kids and grandkids. But we should remember that part of that authority, which the church reminds us in the Catechism and in the documents of Vatican II, is that parents are the primary educators of their children. The primary educators of their children. Families cannot hand over the responsibility or authority to educate their children to anybody. Don't give it up. Cherish it, protect it, fight for it, and do this together as a family. Here's the practical bit. Dad, don't contradict mom when mom is exercising her responsibility for the children. If you disagree, do it in private. Do it later. It's good advice to not fight in front of the kids. Fight later. Don't contradict mom. Mom, don't contradict or disagree or correct dad. It's a common experience in many families that mom thinks of dad as the last child, the one to really take care of as a child after the rest of the children are taken care of. Dad is not a child. Don't act like a child, dad. Mom, don't contradict dad. Do it later. Correct him later. Grandparents, in-laws, don't critique the parents. Do it in private. Let them exercise their authority. Parents and grandparents, don't exasperate your kids or embarrass them or correct them publicly. Do it in private. If a child needs correction or discipline, do it very gently, very quietly, and do it in private so as to not embarrass them. Moreover, our authority, the sense we have of a deputized responsibility, will only work not when we claim authority, but when we do ourselves the various things that we demand of our children. We tell our kids, make your bed, but do I? Go to mass, children, but do I? Attend to your prayers, children, but do I? The point here is show them, show the children. We have lots of grace. We have, in fact, if we're parents and grandparents, husbands and wives, the grace of state. We can do this. We can cooperate with God's grace so as to live joyful, full lives of saintliness and holiness, which is a joyful thing. Consider and reflect on Jesus's life with the Holy Family. He had a mother who prayed and pondered. He had a father who listened to God and responded immediately when God spoke in dreams. Are we as moms and dads, grandparents, doing the same? Here's another way of putting it. Before we exercise our authority to control or limit, bark at children, first we pray. Then we pray some more. And only then do we act. We ourselves, though, need to do all the things, I think, that I've just suggested we want to do for our children. If we want our children to have joyful lives of faith, we need to have joyful lives of faith. We need to turn off the TV, put away the phone, not watch that movie, learn to have leisure, keep the Sabbath, dance, kiss in the kitchen, have bright eyes and fat souls, to love the faith and to love God and to let our children see, to show our children that we struggle and go to confession, to let our children see that we are generally sorry if we have offended our own children, and to quietly and earnestly apologize to our own children for not doing what we ought to have done, and to apologize to them, not only out of love for them, but out of love for God. Here's my last bit of advice, and I want to limit it to fathers and grandfathers. It's the most concrete way that I've not done well in life, right? Is I know how to not be a good dad. So let me talk to fathers just as a moment. Dads, we are presented just now, given all these social challenges and challenges in the church, with a remarkable opportunity. Now, I think I'll admit the truth. I think it's the case that most children, and I think it's generally this case, have been directed in faith and education at mother's knee. Like most dads, I'm sometimes a confused passenger in the airplane when it comes to the education and rearing of my children. If I had to do everything that mom does, the children would be feral. My work's taxing, there's bills to pay, and so I sort of do things in fits and starts. The children would not be well tended, not well educated, not well catechized if it was just me. So what should dads do? I make two broad suggestions. First, dads can offer their own unique hook into reality. Make sure, if you're a dad, that you offer your children, and you'll have your own tastes and knowledge and expertise and hobbies. Do this in your own way. Offer your children and grandchildren real books, real experiences of nature, real dancing. Young people want meaning. They want purpose. And they'll look for it if what we give them is real. Some dads and granddads and uncles are readers and teachers and scholars. Great. Give your kids real books, living books, real books of adventure. Other fathers and grandfathers prefer the outdoors to the library. That's good too. Take your kids and grandkids out to see real birds, to touch real fish, an actual deer antler, to get too close to a skunk. How I remember, and I'm almost 50, my dad allowing me to try to catch a porcupine when I was 8. I remember the terror and sweat of that to this day. Let your kids hear the twang of a real bow. If that's not your thing, that's fine. Let your kids feel oil from a real motor, or the bite of a saw into real wood, or the crack of hickory on hide, or the feel of a hard tackle. And not just on TV or in the stands or on the screen, to do it themselves for real. The real is a gift from God. Get our kids and grandkids into real things. If this is your thing, let your kids and grandkids feel the wind in the sail, the creak and smell of leather on a horse. Our kids have lives which are curated and mediated by television, by the screen. They need to feel a bit of the tang of salt water, the tug of a fish at the end of the line. Anything which is honest and decent and gets them into reality. God sustains all things. If we get our kids into the real, they'll find God. Second, adventure. Every mom knows the story of this. The kids are put to bed, teeth are brushed, pajamas are on, stories are read, prayers are done, and now dad shows up to give the last goodnight kiss. 5 minutes later, the bed is unmade, children are being thrown in the air, chased around the room, tickle tortures have occurred, and mom is exasperated because now kids won't go to sleep. Turns out, children, there's a study on this recently my wife read to me, children sleep better if immediately before bed they are chased or feel physical pressure on their body. Well, guess what? That's what dads tend to do. Now, here's the point. It's okay to be a dad. It's okay to be a man when it comes to parenting our children and bring them into the faith. Part of that throwing the child into the air, the tickle torture, the chasing them around the house, right, is to show our children that a life of adventure includes robustness, brightness, a sporting attitude towards life, that an A+ is not the ultimate goal. Frankly, too many kids and too many boys are a little fussy and a little downtrodden right now. Dads are in some ways uniquely suited to give a sense of adventure. The life of safety and security and comfort, that's not what we're after. We're made for transcendence. As Augustine says, we're restless and slightly discontent until we get to God. Every parent wants their child to be happy. The temptation is to think that happiness is attained when the child is satisfied with herself or himself. That's not right. Happiness includes dynamism, growth, restlessness, and yearning, a bit of adventure. We can teach our kids to be free, to have a sporting attitude, to think that the room in which they move is very large and very exciting. Caring dads, and this is what I'm thinking about mostly here, caring dads want their children to be happy, and happiness includes more than just formal schooling and sitting neatly at a desk. It includes adventure and access to the real. Dads are pretty good at that, and we shouldn't shy away from it. Okay, that's all I got for now. It's time for questions. Thanks for your attention. This is my advice. Remember that God exists and in fact will guide our children to their heavenly home, and to give our children lives which are basically and fundamentally an atmosphere of joy, delight, and adventure. Thanks so much.
Thank you, RJ, for your fascinating talk, your challenge, and your opportunities to hand on the faith to the young that we encounter each and every day within our families, within our parish communities, and our local communities. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, we remind you to please send it in to brandywinedeanery@gmail.com. Brandywinedeanery, all one word. First question we have is, when our kids were growing up, we would go to church every single Sunday, even when it was obviously very inconvenient to do so. I thought the act of obedience to a power higher than ourselves might provide a lesson for the kids. What do you think?
Well, I'm certainly sure it provided a lesson for the kids. One's own obedience does so. At the same time, there's just simply no guarantees. The life of faith is a life of risk. We can think of the fatherhood of God himself. You know, one of the basic problems of evil, which theologians and philosophers and everyone has struggled with, is why is there evil? Well, the answer in the end, of course, which doesn't feel very satisfying, is that God creates us free. There's no guarantee that there won't be evil in the world or disappointments. We take our children to Mass. We keep our own obligation to God by going ourselves. We keep our obligation to train our children. to show them what's right. And there's just simply no guarantee that the freedom that our children have, created in the image of God, will mean that they'll stay practicing, they'll stay faithful. It just doesn't work that way. We cooperate with God's grace, but we are not the providers of grace, and we don't control the freedom of our children, and even God. I mean, think about the words that the Ash Wednesday service begins with. I think it's a quote from Habakkuk, I'm not sure. God hates nothing he has created. Well, God has created us free, including, sometimes we say, alas, our children is free. We do our best, we pray, we cooperate with grace. We, in our own lives, attempt to bring ourselves and our children into the streams of grace, sacraments, mass, and so on. And our children will, in the end, have to choose for themselves which way they will go. So you did teach your children. You did train your children. You did your duty if you took them to Mass. Whether they kept the faith, I don't know. Whether they will return to the faith if they're not doing so just now, I don't know. Now the task is to pray. Now the task is to invite them. Now the task is to show them through your own life that the life of faith is joyous and good. And the word's an awkward one, to seduce them back. But to seduce them back with the joyousness of the Catholic faith.
If you have any questions, we would invite you to send them in. brandywinedeanery@gmail.com.
There's a great film called Into Great Silence, a very challenging film. It's about the Carthusians. It's a film where the director wrote the Grand Chartreuse and asked if he could make a documentary. And the monks at the Grand Chartreuse wrote him back, I think it was 15 years later, and said, sure. Which is pretty funny, right? They wait 15 years to write back. Into Great Silence. A verse flashes up on the screen throughout the film, most of which is in utter silence. And it's a verse from Jeremiah. You have seduced me, O Lord. You've seduced me. Now, the word seduction is an awkward one, right? We think of that as negative or sexual. But the imagery there is people are not argued into the faith or argued back into the faith. They're not tricked or coerced. They're loved back into the faith. They're loved into the faith. God is the one who primarily loves us into faith. It's the Holy Spirit who brings us to faith. Our task as parents is to do something similar. We show and model love and joy. When we have the attention of our children, we tell them what we know, we teach them what we know, but at the end, they have to love what we want them to love, and we can't make them do that.
Good. We have another question. Our family was a regular church-going, and now my adult children are in the group of the nuns. What role do you think the church's handling of sexual abuse impacted the nuns versus the role of social influence of entertainment and other national figures?
Yeah, one of the great difficulties or dangers when you try to explain social causes is false or reduced cause, to want to reduce everything to one thing. It's no doubt in my mind that the church itself has harmed her own moral authority and moral witness in a variety of ways, including the abuse crisis. I just think that's true. At the same time, it seems to me that to suggest, and I'm not saying that anyone is here, to suggest that that is the dominant reason or the sole reason would be an oversimplified cause. There are, I put it this way in the talk, relentless cultural forces, entertainment, movies, television, the schools, politics, the books, etc., trying to convince and succeeding a whole lot our children that the faith is unintelligent, that the faith is benighted, the faith is just very old, it's not up to date, it's irrelevant, it's pointless, it's not true. It's so irrelevant as to not even be true or false. When that relentless cultural pressure is coming, if we as the faithful, or the church, which the faithful are part of, if she damages the church, her own moral authority, it's a scandal. There's a reason to think of the abuse crisis not merely as injustice, although there was injustices, but also a scandal, because the church harmed her own moral authority. And when the relentless cultural pressures are there and we scandalize the young, we do enormous disservice to them.
Great. That is all the questions we have at this point. I'd like to remind everyone that our next speaker is next Wednesday, March 13th, and it's a colleague of Dr. Snell's, Dr. Anna Samuel, who will give us some tips on how to infuse your family life with Catholic culture. She is part of Canabox, which RJ mentioned in his presentation this evening. There we go.
This is great. Anna played a large role in the development of this, along with many others. But tips to talking to your kids about sex. You can get this if you're a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle as well. It's very user-friendly, full of sound and sage advice. Everything from, where does it begin? Ages 2 to 4, 6 through 8, and so on, all the way up to 18. It's a great book and very short. I think it is 50 pages long, and they're pretty small pages. Pretty good advice. You can find that online. Tips for talking to your kids about sex.
So she'll be with us next week for our presentation for next week. I invite you to tell your friends and family members about our series. We'd like to get as many people to enjoy the series that we're doing as possible. There was a question about, can you see the previous ones if you missed them? Yes, at this point, St. Joseph's on the Brandywine website. You can go to their website and they have them all listed there. We're currently working on establishing a deanery website. And once we do that, then they will all be on there for you to be able to enjoy or to go back and to gain some wisdom, more wisdom from what RJ shared with us tonight or any of the other presenters so far in the series. I thank everyone who's helped us with the process this evening, and I thank each of you for your participation in our Lenten speaker series. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you again next week. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.